Well, good afternoon. I hope you enjoyed this morning's session. We now move on to the examination of opportunities in Africa with 4 presentations and panels. I'm very excited about this. During this Focus on Africa afternoon, we will hear from celebrated author and economist, Dr. Dambisa Moyo. She will go over opportunities in frontier markets in general and Africa in particular. Following Dr. Moyo, we will feature 2 panel discussions, mirroring our own investment process, which is a combination of top-down or macro analysis and bottom-up opportunities picking. We first look at top-down factors affecting investments in Africa. This discussion will feature Jendai Fraser, former US Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, and London-based Charles Robertson, Chief Economist of Renaissance Capital. We then will move on to discussions on a bottom-up investment opportunities with Ladi Balogun, Group Managing Director of First City Monument National Bank in Nigeria. He will be joined by my partner and head of Frontier Markets Equity Research, James Johnstone. We will start now with a discussion of one of the continent's most significant success stories, Rwanda. I went to Rwanda in 1991, 22 years ago. The country looked then as you would expect it. Small farms spread across the countryside, and many small markets in towns. Infrastructure was not great at the time. It took me 6 hours to go from the capital, Kigali, to Gisenyi on Lake Kivu. The road was not great, and there were checkpoints with armed men every 10 to 15 miles. The situation even back then was tense. I was going to the Virunga Mountains. The Virunga Mountains are covered by rainforest and bamboo and are really beautiful. And you hike there for 2 to 3 hours to find what was then the main reason to come to Rwanda. Today, there are many more reasons to go to Rwanda, and we'll talk about them in a minute. But back then, the main reason was to see the elusive mountain gorillas. It is one of the most amazing sights of wildlife, and I highly, highly recommend it. I then left with memories of those gorillas and of the very friendly people that I met in Rwanda. For Rwanda, 2 years later, tragedy happened. A genocide of massive proportions. Depending on the estimates, between 500,000 and 1 million people died. Eventually, there was peace, due in no small part to President Kagame. And we'll discuss that in a moment. Rwanda has changed a lot in the last decade. Lots of buildings, cars, construction, satellite TV, and cell phones. For Everest Capital, Rwanda came back on the radar when companies, Rwandan companies, started to get listed. Over the past 20 years, 23 years, that Everest Capital has been in existence, we have participated in many IPOs across emerging markets and frontier markets, providing equity capital to many companies in these fast-growing countries. We see the development of capital markets in Africa as being one of the most exciting opportunities of the next decade. Rwanda has been a very good example of the African capital markets opportunities. There are currently 4 listings in Rwanda, 2 dual listed with the Nairobi Stock Exchange, and 2 local listings, Berlioz Breweries and the Bank of Kigali. We are investors in both listings. Berlioz had its IPO in early 2011, and Bank of Kigali had his IPO later that year. And I'm pleased to say that both have been very successful. Berlioz, the brewery, is an example of our frontier markets consumer theme that I've mentioned this morning. The company is 75% owned by Heineken and has a dominant market share in beer and soft drink sales in Rwanda. Beer consumption in Rwanda has increased, yet it's only today 10 liters per capita per year. 10 liters. As a reference, South Africa is 55 liters. The US is 80 and Germany is 100. But even going to the South African levels, this is going to be a multi-year, possibly a multi-decade opportunity in this company. You can see the performance of Berlioz in dark blue against the Emerging Markets Index in yellow. And then I wanted to show you something. I mentioned this morning how we think to capture opportunities in frontier markets, you cannot invest and capture it by investing in blue chip companies in developed markets. And so in light blue, I put the chart of Heineken, the parent company of Berlioz. And it did well. It did well. It's up about 40%. But again, you would not have captured the opportunity of consumer growth in Rwanda by investing in Heineken. You capture it by investing in Berlioz, which is up 300 and some percent. So again, please keep that concept in mind. The Bank of Kigali, Kigali being the capital of Rwanda, is another good example of our domestic investment theme in frontier markets. It's a development of the financial services industry. As the populations move from an agrarian subsistence economy into a more urban, light manufacturing or service economy, the population of frontier economy experiences a significant increase in disposable income. As long-term interest rates drop, this creates the opportunity to develop credit among people. People wanted to access to middle-income goods, appliances, maybe a refrigerator, a motorcycle, eventually a car, and one day take a mortgage to buy a house. All of those benefit banks. And it's very important, another thing, please to remember, when we think of banks, we think of the problems at Countrywide Credit, at Barclays Bank, because banks in developed markets are very cyclical companies. In a lot of the emerging markets, in particular, at the early stage of development, banks are growth businesses. We believe Bank of Kigali is very well positioned to take advantage of the strong economic growth in Rwanda, has a dominant market share of over 30%, very strong balance sheet. We foresee earnings growth north of 20% for many years to come in the bank. And we remain committed and happy shareholders alongside the government of Rwanda, who's still a 30% shareholder. On a macro basis, Rwanda is a very good example of the renaissance of the African continent. And there are many plans of future development across Africa and in Rwanda in particular. This is a view of a future development in Kigali. Rwanda is a small country. It's the size of Massachusetts or Belgium for the Europeans. Has a population of about 10 million people. It is one of the most densely populated countries in Africa. Exports are currently dominated by coffee, and you have a chance to experience this delicious coffee outside, because we have a special container with Rwandan coffee. And there are also bags of Rwandan coffees that our friends from the government of Rwanda put outside for you to enjoy. But besides coffee, tea, and minerals, it has also been successful in attracting multinationals, such as IBM, that sets up a business in Kigali. The World Bank has ranked Rwanda as the second most active reformer globally between 2005 and 2011. It's now possible to register the new business within 24 hours, making Rwanda the 8th easiest country in the world to start a business. The books on your chairs that were kindly provided by our guests from Rwanda and are written by a couple of American authors gives an intriguing look into the success story of that country. So how did Rwanda's amazing transformation happen? We are honored to be joined by the architect of that success, President Paul Kagame, and our own senior advisor, Condoleezza Rice, who will give us further insights on how it was achieved. We will then explore if the lessons learned can be applied to other countries, with the goal of shedding light on some of the key opportunities in Africa today. Paul Kagame was born in October 1957, and his family fled the pre-independence ethnic persecution and violence that existed in Rwanda by crossing into neighboring Uganda, where he spent 30 years as a refugee. Determined to resist an oppressive regime, as a young man, Paul Kagame joined current Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni to launch a war to free Uganda from dictatorship. In 1990, he returned to Rwanda to lead the Rwandan Patriotic Front in a 4-year struggle to liberate the country from the autocratic government established since independence. Led by Paul Kagame, the Rwandan Patriotic Army defeated the genocidal government in 1994. In 2000, Paul Kagame took the oath of President of the Republic of Rwanda after being elected by the Transitional National Assembly. President Kagame won the first ever democratic election in Rwanda in 2003 and was re-elected for a second 7-year term in 2010. President Kagame has received recognition for his leadership and currently serves as a chair of the United Nations Secretary General Advisory Group on the Millennium Development Goals. Please join me in welcoming President Kagame and Professor Rice.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you heard the story of Rwanda, and to start off, I'd like to focus on the key drivers of Rwanda's success story and to see if the lessons can be applied elsewhere. President Kagame, you had to rebuild the country following the civil war, and you had a very large percentage of your population displaced. How were you able to do that and to set Rwanda on a path to prosperity?
Thank you, Marco, first of all, for inviting me to join you together with Dr. Rice and to be with this great audience. Now, the story of Rwanda that probably is of interest for discussion starts with what you've already mentioned, and that is the tragic situation in 1994. 1 million people lost in a genocide, half or more than half the population displaced internally, and others left the country and were refugees in the neighboring countries. So when we inherited that situation in 1994, it was a daunting task, very difficult, very complex, but we had to start from somewhere, and what we did was to first start with peace and security and stability that we thought people urgently needed in order to return to their homes and be able to start on rebuilding their lives. So that's what we concentrated on, and almost from scratch. There was nothing in the treasury, no administrative institutions, nothing. So we started by building from scratch these institutions, bringing in a sense of security and stability for people where they felt that there was no body going to take their lives again like it was just in the recent history at that time. And really invited and urged people to take ownership for the responsibility of rebuilding the country ourselves, even if we had to enjoy and benefit the support of the global community, because they came forward and they were giving aid through different channels. And so we, however, insisted on taking the lead in this and making sure that even if there was massive support coming from outside, if we didn't take charge ourselves and take ownership and lead the process, this was not going to be very helpful, or if it did, it wasn't going to last, because we had to fill that gap and make sure that we are the ones leading the process of building the foundations that were necessary to be a country again. So in a sense, we averted a situation where we more or less had come close to being a failed state, and we had to reverse that process, and that's how we moved forward.
Failed states. Yes. Kandi, you know something about that. It raises questions on how and when the West should intervene, why it didn't intervene in Rwanda, and now we have all those question marks of whether we should intervene in Syria, in Mali, etc. So is there a framework that we can adopt?
Well, I think that the story of Rwanda, and I was there in 2007 with President Bush and saw this remarkable place and what has been achieved there. But the story of the early 90s, and particularly the horrible situation in 94, is that if you're going to intervene, you probably need to intervene early, not late. Because by the time people were talking about intervening in Rwanda, the UN mission had effectively been overrun, despite the fact that they had been asking for an upgrade in their mission. And what Rwanda shows, though, is that even if the international community does not intervene, many, many, many lives will be lost, and too many lives were lost in Rwanda. But it was really when President Kagame and his colleagues took responsibility for bringing security, and then were able to maintain that security for a substantial period of time. So many failed states, one day a community feels secure, and the next day the terrorists or the rebels are ransacking the community again. And so the key to security, I think, is to have sustained security, and that's hard after conditions like the ones that Rwanda faced in 1994.
Yeah, except in this case, the security ended up being provided by the good guys.
That's right.
Oftentimes, when there is a vacuum, you may have, the Taliban come back, and yes, they provide security, but you go back to the Middle Ages.
And usually, in the worst circumstances, civil wars, the worst elements are the ones that actually tend to benefit. In this case, in Rwanda, we have a circumstance in which, fortunately, it was the patriotic and, as you said, the good guys who were able to provide the security. But that's fairly rare in these circumstances.
President Kagame, from your perspective, when you were seeing what was happening in the country, what would you have wished in terms of intervention to help stop the bloodshed?
Well, that's a difficult question. But you see, the funny situation in this case of our country was that we already had the presence of UN force on the ground. And I remember at one point when there were killings going on across the whole country, and in fact, our force was a bit smaller compared to the government forces and their size, and the militias they had in tens of thousands, augmenting the government forces and doing all that. I remember having a conversation with the commander of the UN force there and was asking them why we could not actually join forces to deal with the situation, rather than us taking on the situation as a whole and overwhelmed, and they were there sitting with the forces and weapons and everything and just watching. And while he told me he did not have instructions or orders from the UN to do anything, so they were just supposed to sit there and watch what was going on. In fact, worse still, as the situation was even getting worse, they actually withdrew the UN forces and reduced their number from close to 6,000 troops that were on the ground and left behind about 250 who would just act as observers of what was going on. So you can therefore imagine, I don't know whether I even had time to wish for anything. I was just trying to do what could possibly be done to make sure that we save as many lives as we could and also stop the killings that were going on.
And I think that those who were involved in the decision-making at the time now have overwhelmingly and almost unanimously say that it was a mistake. That the UN forces on the ground, the UN commander asked for reinforcement. He asked for a stronger mandate so that they could actually intervene. One of the saddest things is, as President Kagame is describing it, when you have UN forces on the ground and they're watching the circumstances unfold, it really does just erode any confidence in the UN. And I remember going to the Genocide Museum that is in Rwanda, and if anyone ever goes there, you have to go. And there was a note from a little boy whose family was about to be overrun, and he had written a note saying, "I know that the UN will come and save us." Oh. And of course it didn't. It was one of the saddest things I've ever seen.
President Kagame, you've put Rwanda on the path to prosperity. Where do you see going forward? What's your vision?
Well, we have tried. As you earlier remarked, Rwanda is coming from a very low base almost on everything. Other than the survival issues we've left behind us, we are now trying to live a normal life as other people of this world we live in. And what we have tried to do is to make sure that, first of all, there have been various reforms going on in the country, political, economic, and building institutions to make sure that we lay this very firm foundation on which the people of Rwanda can continue to go about their businesses and improve their lives themselves, and working together and working with the rest of the world. So our vision has been to bring together the people of the country back to work together, to live with each other in harmony and really value each other instead of the divisive politics we have had in the past, and making sure that Rwanda becomes a nation again, irrespective of whatever divides us. We still are a nation of Rwanda. We can still live together and work together and work with the rest of the world. But it all starts with the people, and we have sought to invest in our people, invest in education, in health, and make sure that our people have the kinds of capacities to be able to contribute and participate inclusively. Everybody has to be part of that and make sure that we move towards prosperity.
Kondi, you travel a lot. In your experience, how much of what Rwanda achieved can be replicated elsewhere?
Obviously, you need leadership in order to do it. And President Kagame said something very important. Rwanda was a country that was riven with ethnic conflict. Some have said Africa is so tribal, these people divide themselves. These countries have to come together around a common identity and a common future. That's number one. Secondly, you do have to have institutions and rule of law. You have to have institutions that are reliable. You have to fight corruption. People can't believe that the leaders are just benefiting and the people are not. But something that the president said is really extremely important in the 21st century, countries that mobilize human potential, that make their populations healthy, that educate their populations and give them skills, that empower women as well as men, these are going to be the countries that progress. We have a tendency to think about infrastructure, roads. As you mentioned, roads are improving in Rwanda. Airports into which people, that's infrastructure. But the infrastructure of the people, that may be the most important thing that you could do. And the president was describing to me last night, Marco, and perhaps he would like to mention it, that even if people are not able to get a college education, you have a program working to get them skills for jobs. Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's right.
Yes, perhaps you could.
We are building vocational and technical training institutions that between the higher institution of education and the secondary, primary, secondary level, in between there are these institutions that can give people skills to be able to work anywhere depending on these skills, in factories, in different places. And we have forged partnerships with the different countries that have this kind of capability, like South Korea and Germany. We have partnered to build these institutions, and we are already finding that this is absorbing a big population of our young people who are finishing 9-year basic education, which the country is providing for free, and the university level. So if those who cannot proceed to the university level, college level, they are absorbed within these institutions, and they have the possibility also of finishing that, and if they choose, they can continue for higher education.
At Everest Capital, we believe in the concept of hubs. We're based in Miami, which is a hub to Latin America, in Singapore, which is a big Asian hub. We have investments in Dubai and Panama, which are regional hubs. And Mr. President, you have talked about turning Rwanda in a regional hub. Can you give us more details how you see that vision?
Yes. Well, it really starts with our ambition, first of all, to try and create something unique about our country, but also building not only opportunities, but actually driven even by wanting to deal with the challenges we face as a country that is landlocked. We have no alternative to making sure that we focus on high-value goods that we can produce or services that we can provide. And therefore, again, you have to have people who are qualified for this or trained for this. So there are people who have to have such skills that will play into this marketplace. So what we did, other than education and focusing on certain, for example, we've been focusing on science and technology and other areas that make it that possible, that ambition possible. We have also invested in the kinds of infrastructure that, together with that, can then deliver that ambition to us. And that's how we have invested. For example, today we have about 4,000 kilometers of fiber, and we are able to provide broadband across the country to rural areas, to schools, to health centers, and different areas. So IT as an area that we have focused on and invested in and trained our people, so is already providing the kind of backbone for being a hub. We're looking at services hub, whether financial or other kinds of services. We are looking at logistics hub. And in fact, we have invested in already an airline that is taking off and serving as a regional airline, now connecting Rwanda or people through Rwanda to West, Central, and South Africa, and it is also now going up to Dubai. So this is how it is shaping up, and we hope we can continue to advance on it.
Kandi, as a historian, looking at the young democracy that seems to have done most things right so far, what do you see the main risks for a country at this stage of development?
Well, obviously, one of the great risks is to the political institutions themselves. Political institutions, when they begin, are fragile. People have to come to trust them. They have to come to trust the court system. They have to come to trust the electoral system. They have to come to trust the justice system. They have to come to trust the security forces. We forget in the United States that this for us took place more than 200 years ago, but there was a time when we didn't trust our institutions very much. And so I think the big risk is that the political institutions have to keep proving themselves over and over and over. It's important that elections be fair. It's important that the media has the capacity to critique government, but also to expose problems. Sometimes it's a very good thing. Sometimes the government at the top doesn't even know what's going on at the bottom, and sometimes these things will be exposed through the press. So I think the biggest challenge is to political institutions to keep evolving, keep getting better, keep gaining the trust of the people. And when institutions are new, one little misstep, and it isn't that you're thrown back just a little bit, you're thrown back quite a lot. And so keeping political institutional development going is important. The other thing is obviously the president and I worked a lot on some of the regional security problems. Rwanda's neighborhood can be rather difficult sometimes, and those regional challenges can be quite daunting.
If I may add to what Dr. Rice has just said, that is very important. It's all about, again, it goes back to the people. I think earning the trust and the confidence of the people, and for the people to be able to relate to each other also in the same way is very important. And the two things happen here as we have experienced it, and of course we always have to think long term and make sure we are talking about the sustainability of what we are doing, not doing one good thing and benefiting, for a short time and then you lose it. So we make sure that there is inclusiveness. For example, if you look at our economic growth that we have registered in the last, say, 10 years, which has been swinging between 7 and 9% every year. We have also been able to monitor and make sure that this growth is just not impressive numbers and concentrated in a few. We make sure that actually this growth trickles down to the ordinary person, and what is happening and that is driving this growth is shared even at the lowest levels. This has a high impact even on the thinking of the population and how they behave and how they act in their own interest and in the wider interest. The second part of it is how that relates to the regional integration, which Dr. Rice has just mentioned, that is also very important. Once you have this confidence within the country and the growth and the stability and making sure that it reaches everyone, and then how it relates with the neighbors and how this within the integration process we can be able to move forward.
Very good. At this point, I'd like to open it to questions.
About 5 years ago, I met a young man from Rwanda who was in the United States, and I asked him whether he was Tutsi or Hutu. And he said, I'm neither one, I'm Rwandan. And he said that this was something that really had been engendered in the population in Rwanda to not think along tribal lines. And Kanda, you sort of talked about fairness and trust in the institutions. I think that's a huge change, and I know in a lot of other countries, and you can take a look at what happened in the last Kenyan elections, which are going on now, knock on wood, peacefully. There was a lot of tribal feelings and animosities that came out, and being able to overcome that was huge. Could you just comment on it, President Kagame? Because I was very impressed with that.
Well, that's where our country has come from. We have a history where, first of all, even if our people are to be different, whatever diversity there is in our society, the problem in that history was that during the colonial days especially, and later on the other Rwandan leaders, they used the difference not for the common good of the nation, but rather to actually fragment the country and break it apart. And there was even a teaching that we are different from each other, and therefore we should not have anything to do with each other, and so on and so forth. And that's how the country really broke apart, and that's how we even reached the point of a genocide. So the problems were twofold. One was the Rwandans cannot run away from our own responsibility, certainly, but there were these external factors that overplayed how different we are and how bad we should be to each other, and so on and so forth. So in today's Rwanda, what we are trying to do is to say, well, let's be different, that we are, but let's also find in ourselves, even in our differences, find something that is commonly good to all of us. So being different is some kind of asset, after all, if you will. What I don't have, maybe you have, and what you have, you don't have, maybe I have. So we can bring that together and be able to move forward as a nation. And this is how I'm sure the young man probably, what we've been doing in our country through reconciliation, and even where we have had to make sure that there is justice going on so that we avoid the kind of impunity that there was in Rwanda, to the extent that people would kill others and so on. We have to make sure that as we go along the path of making sure that justice is seen to be done, we also be mindful of the need to bring the society back to be able to live together as to where. So that delicate balance is what has developed into saying, well, after all, whether there are Hutus or Tutsis or Twas, and you see in our case it is quite different from some of these other African societies and tribes, if you will. In Rwanda, there are those Hutus, Tutsis, Twas, three, they call them ethnic group, I don't know, but we see. We speak one language. Mm-hmm. Everything else is shared, culture, language, everything. The only difference was Tutsis were cattle keepers, Hutus are crop farmers, Twas are crafts people, involved in pottery. But there is this that we share, almost everything else. So, and we were saying, well, why don't we emphasize what is common to us? Yes, and just also harness what we are known to be different for and bring that together for the common good of everyone. So whether you are a Hutu or a Twa or a Tutsi, fine, you can be proud of that. But there is a line you can't cross. You can't use who you are to the detriment of the other who is different from you. It's what we are saying. And we found the best way the best language for that would be, let's be Rwandans. And then we can be what else we want to be later on. Whether it is religion, you are Catholic, you are a Muslim, that's fine. But we are commonly Rwandan.
President Kagame, my question is a little bit different. Many of us are raised with role models, people we identify as heroes that kind of establish the direction that we think we should be going in this world. What would you look to in that regard that kind of guided you in the direction that you went?
Well, again, my background is a bit complex. I grew up as a refugee for 30 years in a refugee camp, and I experienced injustices of all kinds. And as I was growing up then, well, first of all, the question was always, in fact, I remember when I was just 12 years, I asked my own father, I said, why and how did we become refugees? Is there anything wrong that you did or others did of your age that I don't know that we need to? So my father went into the whole history and was trying to emphasize to me that there was nothing like that, and told me a lot about politics and so on and so forth. So I grew up in this kind of environment. And therefore, at a certain stage when I grew up, when I was 19, 20, that's when I started getting involved in the kinds of activities that later on put me to be in the liberation struggle and so on. And whatever was at the back of my mind was, well, first of all, we can't continue to live this kind of life. We got to sort it out, and there is nobody else going to sort it out for us unless we do something about it. So that's how many of us came together, and that's how we formed the Rwandese Patriotic Front, and that's how we got involved in the struggle. At the same time, what was driving us again was, at least in my mind, was with this kind of injustice and life of injustice that I have lived, that many of us have lived, would we be the kind of people that would make injustice on others? So that has always been the driving, factor in my mind. So it's make sure that what you are trying to do is even if the mistakes were to be made, but the main driving thing would be make sure you are trying to do what is right and trying to avoid that may make somebody else live the kind of life you lived that, reduced you to this kind of level where you had to give everything you had to be able to, including possibility of losing your life, to be able to regain it. So it's so precious, it's something that therefore you have to look at and say this is maybe how some of these issues should be dealt with. So that's how it is.
Right here in front.
Mr. President, Dr. Rice, thank you. Given your infrastructure, your telecommunications infrastructure and the broadband access that citizens have, are you looking at different ways to accelerate learning, whether or not it's linked to Stanford or not? But are there ways that you can, I know Singapore has been an influence on the way you've looked at things, so I just wanted to find out if there are plans or opportunities.
Yes. Absolutely. There are many reasons why we took this path of investing in the kinds of infrastructure and therefore how we want to use the infrastructure. First of all, we wanted to make sure that every Rwandan has access to tools of communication and information. Now, what they use that for, there are many things, and the sky is the limit here, and as we also have discovered along the way. Together with that, we have another project that, in fact, we are working on with a group from MIT. They brought up an issue of called, it's Professor Negroponte, one laptop per child. And we have already, by this time, bought close to 300,000 computers. Well, we have, for example, in a primary school, we have about 2.3 million children attending primary school. We wanted to give each child a computer and be able to use, you know, the kind of infrastructure backbone that we have put in place for learning. So that means this far, each computer will be shared among many, but still this is better than not having anything. Even if you have one computer for every 5 to 7 children, and they take turns, each one goes with it one day, another one takes it home another day, and you know, within 7 days, 7 children have had a hand on the computer. And it's enormous what they do with these computers, these young people. In fact, I remember when they had just been brought in, there was a program of training teachers how they would use them to teach the young children. But the young children asked to go home with their computers. By the, you know, while the teachers were halfway through the course, the children were saying, no, but we know how to use these computers. And they were already showing the teachers how they should. So the learning is as free as that, and you just have to make sure you avail some of the tools, and the rest, there are people who know what best to do.
One last question, please.
Thank you very much for coming and speaking. And I think that one of the topics that's come up a couple of different times in a couple of different ways is the importance of security and stability. And just along that line, I was just wondering if you could possibly comment on the situation in Eastern DRC and your thoughts on what is needed to resolve these issues and ultimately what that looks like. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, again, this is one of those very difficult situations and very complex, which sometimes people approach with or give a simplistic approach and hope they resolve the problem. But problems won't just go away even if you have the best of intentions, until you do what is right that needs to be done. First, this problem of Eastern Congo, in my view, is not just an Eastern Congo problem, because there is no country called Eastern Congo. It's actually Congo. So you can't just say Eastern Congo and you think, even if you are focused on that, you have resolved the problem. You have to fix the bigger problem, which is Congo itself and the neighbors, if you will, who affect each other. Congo affects the neighbors affect Congo, and so on and so forth. But there is a long history to that as well. So there are short, medium, long-term solutions to the problem. And again, let's look at what has been done. Dr. Rice, I'm sure, is very conversant with that. There has been a force, a UN force in the Congo for the last, I think now, 12 years. The cost of it is about 1.5 billion every year. And if I was to ask anybody who lives there and say, well, for these 12 years, for this cost, what have you got out of it? There is absolutely nothing. Now, if you were to ask me in a simple question, probably if we use the fraction of that and helped the people in the Congo, in Eastern Congo, to fix some of the few things, institutions, and even providing water to people and food, and building schools and building the police institutions, and this probably would have had better results. Well, but somebody will tell you, no, this is how we do things. And they are there thinking they are going to bring a difference. In fact, that's how, in the end, when so many years have passed like that, so much has been spent on it, no results, that's how we find ourselves in the situation where we are. The problem becomes Rwanda. It is the simplest way to explain it.
Right. But could we argue that Congo is a failed state?
Oh, it's most certainly in
and
that
so
category, yes.
That's Rwanda's problem, is you have a failed state on your neighbor.
Well, we will always be affected for a long time. Yeah. We just try to make sure we avail ourselves to work with our neighbor and our neighbors to see what we can do. But the international community is doing a disservice to the situation. And then they will be the ones to turn around and blame everybody else for the problem.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President Condi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.